It's 1876, and the United States dispatches its celebrated hero George Custer to subdue Sitting Bull's defiance in Montana. As the general ascends a ridge, he beholds a vast array of tents, far exceeding what he anticipated. Undaunted, Custer flashes a grin, lifts his hat, and shouts, "Cheer up, lads! We've cornered them!" Unbeknownst to him, he's marching into one of the grandest native Indian war encampments ever gathered, with no reinforcements on the way to rescue him. In a mere hour, every soldier under his command lies dead. Custer's name, rather than echoing with triumph, becomes tied to one of the gravest disasters in American military annals. How did such a calamity unfold? This is the astonishing tale of Custer's last fight. George Custer hailed from a humble Ohio farming family. He was a man of rare ambition, yearning for fame and a lasting mark in the chronicles of time. As a youth, he was clever, daring, and full of pride. In 1857, he enrolled at West Point, where he racked up 726 infractions for mischief, a record unmatched by any cadet before him. Yet, his teachers and peers couldn't overlook that this rebellious spirit possessed the makings of a remarkable soldier. The Civil War came, offering Custer the stage to prove his worth. Custer shone as an exceptional officer, securing numerous triumphs throughout the war, always leading his troops from the forefront. He earned a name for charging into perils where others feared to tread. He'd never order a soldier to undertake a task he wouldn't face beside them. His men revered him, and his commanders were so struck by his valor that at just 23, he rose to become one of the youngest generals in the nation's history. The newspapers called him the Boy General. Before long, all knew of the gallant General Custer, famed for his bold flair and distinctive long golden locks. On the 3rd day of July in 1863, George Custer and his soldiers stood firm at the Battle of Gettysburg, defending the Union's line. Clad in full officer's garb, Custer led a daring charge against Confederate forces at a pivotal moment, turning the battle's tide to favor the Union. His heroic deeds persisted until the war's final hour. The table, where Robert E. Lee signed his surrender, later presented to Custer's wife, bore a note declaring, "No man did more to bring about this surrender than your husband." After the war, Custer was tasked with leading the 7th Cavalry to confront the Plains native Indians. He loathed this duty, believing it robbed him of chances for fame. It wasn't until 1868 that he found another opportunity to chase the renown he craved. As the United States pressed westward, it set its sights on the Black Hills. The Sioux, who had long called that land home, were not willing to yield it. In April of 1868, the Sioux and the U.S. inked the Fort Laramie Treaty, granting the Sioux full claim to the Black Hills, provided they ceased attacks on settlers and remained on a reservation. But the U.S. had no intention of upholding this pact. The Black Hills held too much value, and the U.S. anticipated that a flood of settlers would soon provoke the Sioux into breaking the treaty. Unaware of this betrayal, most Sioux accepted the agreement. One who refused was Chief Sitting Bull. A Lakota, one of the two main branches of the Sioux, Sitting Bull rejected the treaty outright. He believed the U.S. would encroach on their lands no matter what, and that resistance was the only path to preserve their way of life. Sitting Bull was the opposite of Custer. While Custer was brash and impulsive, Sitting Bull was steady and deliberate. His name reflected his habit of pondering before acting. More than a war chief, he was a spiritual leader. He claimed visions from the Great Spirit, guiding him to defeat the Americans. He rallied many Lakota to his cause, along with members of the neighboring Cheyenne and other small bands. Sitting Bull forged a coalition of roving warriors to fend off American advances. Alongside his trusted ally, a Lakota named Gall, they struck at American settlements and rivaled native Indian tribes like the Crow and Arikara. In the months after the Fort Laramie Treaty, Sitting Bull's coalition began raiding U.S. outposts. The United States needed a bold and skilled leader to halt Sitting Bull. They called on George Custer. In October 1868, Custer set out with the 7th Cavalry. Winter loomed, a time when the native Indians were most exposed. Following the Ouachita River in Oklahoma, Custer tracked a Cheyenne camp by November 26th. At first light on the 27th, he led a fierce charge through the encampment, striking down all in their path. Some were Cheyenne fighters, but most were women and children. His second-in-command, Major Joel Elliott, took 20 men to chase the fleeing Cheyenne, while Custer finished his work in the camp. A total of 103 Cheyenne perished, and Custer deemed it a triumphant victory. Yet, his thirst for personal glory had once again clouded his judgment. The village Custer struck belonged to a Cheyenne chief who was friendly to the U.S., rendering peace with the Cheyenne nearly unattainable. Moreover, it was but one of many villages along the river, and news of the attack swiftly reached the other Cheyenne camps upstream, compelling Custer to retreat in haste. This sparked a third calamity. Major Joel Elliott had not returned. With the remaining Cheyenne villages now rallying, Custer chose not to linger for him. Weeks later, the bodies of Major Elliott and all his men were discovered. Many in the 7th Cavalry held Custer responsible for their deaths. Captain Frederick Benteen was the most vocal detractor, penning a letter that pinned the blame on Custer for Elliott's demise. The letter reached the press, enraging Custer. Though Benteen remained under his command, their mutual resentment never faded. Yet, Custer's triumph at Ouachita restored his fame. Now hailed as a champion of the American frontier, Custer spent the next few years leading the 7th Cavalry against the native Indians. In 1873, he was stationed permanently at Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota, better positioned to counter Sitting Bull and his defiance of American forces. At this juncture, two key figures entered his tale. First, Major Marcus Reno joined Custer's staff as a vital officer. Reno was a cantankerous man, plagued by a heavy drinking habit, and like Captain Benteen, he found Custer insufferable and haughty. Luckily for Custer, he could surround himself with loyal allies to offset critics like Benteen and Reno. His brothers, Tom and Boston, joined him, as did his brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun, and even his wife relocated to Fort Abraham Lincoln to stand by his side. Custer's allies weren't solely white Americans, however. In 1873, a scout named Bloody Knife, half Sioux and half Arikara, was assigned to Custer's unit, and the two forged a strong bond. Not every native Indian sided with Sitting Bull. Bloody Knife harbored a deep grudge against him. He had known Sitting Bull in years past, but had always been ill-treated by him. He particularly despised Gall, Sitting Bull's trusted lieutenant, who had tormented Bloody Knife in their youth. This childhood enmity turned tragic. Bloody Knife once nearly slew Gall in a brawl, while Gall later killed Bloody Knife's brothers and son in separate raids. Custer was the clear choice to lead an expedition into the Black Hills in 1874. Officially, the mission was to locate a site for a fort to curb Sitting Bull's resistance. In truth, its primary aim was to uncover gold in the Black Hills and serve as a grand spectacle to spur a flood of prospectors and settlers into the region. The expedition resembled a leisurely tour more than a military campaign. They faced no significant opposition, and Custer fired more shots hunting alongside his brothers in Bloody Knife than battling native Indians. Photographers and journalists trailed the expedition, publishing tales and images of Custer's thrilling frontier exploits and the successful discovery of gold. Custer's venture ignited a gold rush. By the close of 1875, some 15,000 white settlers had surged into the area. Officially, as these were independent settlers, the U.S. government bore no blame, thus avoiding a breach of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Unofficially, President Ulysses S. Grant wholly endorsed their actions and awaited Sitting Bull and the Lakota's violent response, which would provide a pretext to seize the Black Hills outright. In September 1875, Washington made a final plea to the Sioux to sell the Black Hills peacefully. Sitting Bull's warnings that the Americans would relentlessly pursue their lands proved true. The Sioux rebuffed the offer, prompting the president to issue a stark ultimatum. Any Lakota or Cheyenne who did not relocate to U.S. reservations by January 1876 would be deemed hostile. This was an impossible demand. The decree was issued in November 1875, with winter already gripping the land. Even those willing to comply would face death by freezing in the attempt. It was a blatant injustice, plain as day. The campaign to hunt down Sitting Bull and his defiant native Indians set out from Fort Abraham Lincoln on May 17, 1876. Supreme command of the expedition rested with General Alfred Terry, a steadfast ally of Custer. Scouts reported that Sitting Bull had rallied his followers along the Yellowstone River, near where 4 smaller streams, the Powder, Tongue, Rosebud, and Bighorn, flowed into it. Terry and Custer would guide the main army westward along the Yellowstone from Dakota. A second force, led by General John Gibbon, would advance from Montana in the west, while a third, under General George Crook, would march northward from Wyoming. Their aim was to seal off every escape route, corralling the native Indians like livestock pinned between the armies. Custer approached the mission with his usual carefree spirit, treating it like a grand adventure. Even Terry grew exasperated with Custer's frequent detours to hunt or roam with his brothers. Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen were equally irked. Reno found brief respite when Terry sent him on a scouting mission down the Rosebud River for several days, where he uncovered Sitting Bull's trail. Reno hurried back with the news, but Custer branded him a coward for not pressing the pursuit. With Sitting Bull's path now clear, there was no time for the two to bicker. Terry opted to divide his forces once more. He would join Gibbon's Montana troops and descend the Bighorn River from the north. Custer, meanwhile, would head south, tracing the trail across the Rosebud. They now had a solid sense of Sitting Bull's whereabouts. If Custer found Sitting Bull, he was to circle south and await Terry and Gibbon's arrival from the north. Given Custer's reputation, however, expecting him to hold back was akin to asking a famished hound to ignore a feast laid before it. Everyone knew Custer would chase glory the instant it beckoned. "Custer, don't be selfish. Save some for us," they jested as he departed. "No," he replied firmly, "I shall not." The Americans' instincts were correct. Sitting Bull and his native Indians were precisely where they'd been expected. Following President Ulysses S. Grant's ultimatum earlier that year, Sitting Bull had amassed thousands more warriors. They knew the Americans were coming, and sheer numbers were their only hope of survival. Failure could mean their final summer as free wanderers of the plains. Sitting Bull's call echoed far, drawing roughly 8,000 souls to his cause. Gall remained his closest confidant, but new, formidable leaders joined him. Among them, Crazy Horse shone brightest. A young Lakota from a different clan, Crazy Horse was vibrant, daring, and utterly fearless. Like Sitting Bull, he claimed visions granted him great strength, the source of his name. It was Crazy Horse who first clashed with the American forces that summer. On June 17th, General Crook's Wyoming troops were encamped along the Rosebud River when Crazy Horse's scouts spotted them. Leading 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, Crazy Horse did the unimaginable. He charged an American army of nearly equal size. In the past, native Indians needed vast numbers to prevail in open combat. Crazy Horse defied this. He directed his warriors to swarm the Americans from all sides, denying them a moment's rest. One rider would surge from the left, another from the right, leaving the Americans uncertain where to aim. Only the timely aid of Crook's Crow and Shoshone scouts allowed Crook to retreat after losing 30 men. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull had achieved a near miraculous victory against the Americans in open battle. Crook, rattled, wrote to his superiors about the most remarkable display of native Indian combat he'd ever witnessed. Crucially, he failed to send word to Custer or Terry. Aware that American forces were closing in, Sitting Bull ordered his people to relocate to a new encampment. Some 8,000 Lakota and Cheyenne trailed Sitting Bull to a place they named the Valley of the Greasy Grass. They raised their lodges beneath the hills along the Little Bighorn River, which joined the main Bighorn a few miles north. There, they held their ancient Sundance ceremony as they had for generations. During that Sundance, it was said Sitting Bull received another vision. He saw hundreds of American soldiers tumbling into the native Indian camp. He took it as a sign that a mighty triumph was near. Meanwhile, Custer's men had followed Sitting Bull's trail over the Rosebud and across the hills toward the Bighorn River, unaware of Crook's defeat days earlier. Bloody Knife and the other scouts noticed the trail hinted at far more native Indians than Custer anticipated, perhaps thousands. Bloody Knife cautioned Custer that the numbers might be too great to face alone and urged waiting for Terry and Gibbon before attacking. Just after dawn on June 25th, Custer's scouts ascended hills a few miles east of the Little Bighorn and spotted smoke rising from Sitting Bull's camp. Custer's mind was set. This was his day for glory. Custer commanded 700 men, divided into 12 companies. One stayed back to guard supplies, but the rest would ride into battle. Custer would lead 5 companies across the river to strike the camp from the north. Major Reno took 3 to attack from the south, with Bloody Knife scouting the path. Captain Benteen would lead the remaining 3, swinging farther south around Reno before joining the fight on the camp's western edge. Custer, though irked to rely on two men he despised, had his trusted kin, brothers Tom and Boston, and brother-in-law Lieutenant James Calhoun, by his side. Moving north, he kept his men hidden behind hills until the last moment. Around 3:30 p.m., he reached the final ridge overlooking the camp and saw thousands of lodges sprawled over 3 miles. The camp was far larger than expected. He scrawled a hasty order. "Benteen, come quick, big village, hurry, bring packs, and sent a rider to deliver it. Never one to pause, Custer pressed forward. The boy general raised his hat high, shouting, "Hurrah, lads, we've trapped them!" Then he charged down the slope. To the south, Major Reno's 150 men had crossed the river and neared the camp. Bloody Knife and the scouts first met Lakota and Cheyenne warriors on the camp's outskirts, giving Sitting Bull's people their first warning of the attack. As was custom, Sitting Bull and Gall were in the southern part of the camp, first to face Reno's assault. When Reno met resistance, he ordered his men to dismount and form a firing line. Bullets tore into the camp, striking men, women, and children. Sitting Bull's first thought was to shield his people. He sent his nephew and another warrior south to parley with the attackers. Both were shot dead. Sitting Bull mounted his horse, only for an American bullet to fell it beneath him. That was the breaking point. "They've killed my finest horse. It's as if they've struck me," he cried. "Charge them!" Gall and Crazy Horse led the counterattack in the south. Reno, unprepared for organized resistance, was halted in his tracks. Survivors later said Reno had been drinking all day, clouding his judgment. Reno and Bloody Knife tried to plan their next move. In the tight-knit Lakota world, some warriors likely recognized Bloody Knife beside Reno, making him a clear target. Mid-sentence, a bullet struck Bloody Knife in the back of the head, killing him instantly. His blood and brains splattered across the drunken major's face. Bloody Knife's death crushed Reno's nerve, and he called a retreat. "Any who wish to save yourselves, follow me," he shouted. Order dissolved as Reno's men fled back across the river, abandoning horses and rifles as they scrambled through the water and up steep banks. The native Indians needed only to stand on the opposite shore and fire. To the southeast, Benteen, hearing the chaos, returned to investigate. As he waited atop a hill, Reno clambered up with a few surviving men, pleading, "For heaven's sake, Benteen, hold your men and aid me. I've lost half my command." Benteen scowled, asking one question: "Where's Custer?" Reno had no reply. Benteen shook his head, sensing a grim repeat of past failures. "It's another Major Elliott fiasco," Benteen muttered, recalling the Wachita debacle years prior. He believed Custer had, once again, forsaken them in pursuit of fame, or so he later claimed. Yet the sound of gunfire roaring from Custer's direction hinted at a graver unfolding. Benteen received Custer's scrawled plea to rush to his aid, but dismissed it. Instead, he and Reno lingered atop the hill for 2 hours until the gunfire dwindled. One of Benteen's exasperated captains finally rode out to investigate, and what he discovered left him stunned. The precise fate of Custer after he charged down the slope remains shrouded. What follows is the clearest recounting of Custer's last stand. Custer rallied his men atop a rise later dubbed Calhoun Hill to assess the scene and await Benteen. Custer often took native Indian hostages to force surrender, and he likely aimed to repeat this tactic. His plan was to cross the Little Bighorn into the camp, seize as many women and children as possible, and compel Sitting Bull to yield to save them. It seemed a straightforward task: charge down the hill and ford the river. Custer would have led from the forefront, a fearsome sight with his men thundering behind. Even Sitting Bull, upon hearing of Custer's northern assault, felt dread. "We thought we were done for," he admitted. But Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, hidden across the river, unleashed a barrage on the Americans. By then, Crazy Horse and the camp's warriors had broken off their pursuit of Reno and raced to confront Custer. Custer had misjudged their numbers. His men began retreating back up the hill. Lieutenant James Calhoun and his company entrenched atop a ridge now bearing his name. Custer, his brothers Tom and Boston, and most others, fell back to what is now called Last Stand Hill. From the fallen, it's clear half of Calhoun's men never reached his position. Within moments, Crazy Horse led a band of mounted warriors to encircle them from behind, while the main native Indian force chased them up the slopes. Calhoun's men were overwhelmed, every last one slain. As his brother-in-law's position crumbled, Custer must have realized Benteen wasn't coming with the aid he'd begged for. Thousands of native Indians swarmed the hills, engulfing the remnants of Custer's force. His last men fell around him, cut down by a tempest of arrows and bullets. The chaos was so fierce that some native Indians struck their own in the fray. No one knows who stood last, but Sitting Bull later shared what his warriors recounted. They said that on the hill where the final fight raged, the long-haired Custer stood like a sheaf of corn, with all the ears fallen around him. His last stand may have been the final one. Soon after the gunfire from Custer's position ceased, Benteen and Reno found themselves besieged at their vantage, now called Reno Hill. Their 400 men dug in, fending off the native Indians through the night of June 25th. Only at dusk, on June 26th, when scouts spotted Terry and Gibbon approaching from the north, did Sitting Bull order his people to withdraw. General Alfred Terry arrived soon after. His first question echoed Benteen's, "Where's Custer?" The bodies of 200 men from 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry lay where they fell the previous day. Some had been scalped and mutilated by the native Indians. As Benteen walked among the corpses, a private urgently called him to one body. 2 bullet wounds, one in the chest, one in the head. "My God, it's him," Benteen gasped. On July 6, 1876, word of Custer's catastrophic defeat reached the 7th Cavalry's headquarters at Fort Abraham Lincoln. Within days, the entire nation learned of the Little Bighorn disaster. Just days prior, on July 4, 1876, America had rejoiced in its centennial, brimming with hope and pride in its progress and heroes like Custer, then battling savage native Indians. His death seemed unthinkable. Americans viewed themselves as invincible bearers of civilization. When news broke that native Indians had slain a hero like Custer and 268 men in open battle, most struggled to comprehend it. Some pointed to Custer's recklessness. He always charged headlong into peril for glory, and it finally overtook him. Many faulted Benteen and Reno, who ignored Custer's orders, sitting idly while his men were slaughtered. Few, surprisingly, gave due credit to Sitting Bull and his native Indians, who had proven themselves formidable warriors twice over. America had sent its finest against them and lost. Sitting Bull stood ready for whatever came next. But what if the story we've been told isn't the full truth? In the wake of Custer's catastrophic defeat, America mourned its golden boy, but whispers began to circulate. Whispers that the disaster at Little Bighorn was no accident. Recently uncovered letters suggest a chilling possibility. Custer's charge may have been orchestrated to fail. The Black Hills, rich with gold, were too valuable to leave in Sioux hands. A martyr's death could ignite public outrage, justifying a full-scale military campaign to seize the land once and for all. Was Custer set up as a sacrificial pawn? Did Terry, under orders from Washington, withhold critical intelligence about the size of Sitting Bull's camp? Some historians now claim that Custer's orders to charge ahead, despite warnings from scouts like Bloody Knife, were part of a calculated plan to provoke a massacre. The public's fury would drown out any questions about broken treaties or gold-driven greed. Sitting Bull and his warriors won a historic victory, but at a cost they could not foresee. Custer's death became a rallying cry, not for peace, but for vengeance. Within a year, the U.S. Army flooded the plains, shattering the Sioux and Cheyenne resistance. The Black Hills were taken, and Sitting Bull's vision of freedom faded into exile. But the question lingers, was Custer's last stand a tragic blunder or a deliberate betrayal? Today marks the 149th commemoration of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The truth lies buried. What do you believe?